All right, here are the ways to contact me if you're looking for me. You can call me in the studio right now while I'm recording at 1-800-465-744. So, of course, today, unfortunately, I am pre-recording, so you can't do that today, but normally, yeah. The office number is 1-800-667-3703, and my extension is 2211. My email is jillian.percy@nnec.on.ca or jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. My Facebook page down below is capital G, capital P-E-R-C-Y, space, capital W-A-H-S-A. If you are sending me a friend request on Facebook, please try to put a little message there too, because the friend requests don't always seem to pop up for some reason, but the messages always do. There are 2 different YouTube channels that you can find classes on. One is the teacher YouTube channel, which has all my classes from last year as well as the classes from this year. And then down here we have the school YouTube channel, which does not have anything from last year. It's only this year, but it's all the different teachers. So it's really useful if you are taking multiple classes from this. All right, how to hand in work. If you are taking a photograph of the assignment, please make sure it's clear enough so that your writing can be read. Once you've taken the picture, please download it to your phone or computer, save it, and then send it as an attachment in the email. If you just share it directly in the email, it's very hard for us to print off and it doesn't show properly on the computer. Whenever you hand in work, please send it to studentwork@nnec.on.ca. You can include me in the email if you want to be saved. When you do this, the secretary can log that you submitted the work and other people can access it if need be. Please include your full name, the course name, the assignment number and name. And if an assignment asks for both a rough and a good draft, please label which one is which and include them both in the same email. All right, here is our plan for the week. We are on the last day here. We are hoping to get through assignment 27 and assignment 28. And then next week we are on holidays and we will not be back on the air until January 6th. You can continue to hand in assignments during that time period, but I won't see them until I come back on January 6th. So here is today's work. We are going to understand how to research a person, decide if a website is useful, discuss important criteria for prioritizing and summarizing, review the difference between retelling and summarizing, read an excerpt from Never Cry Wolf, review how to create a summary paragraph, look at some writing tips to make writing more fluent, look at verb consistency. We might not get to that one today. I think that one we may have taken off. Parallelism, and I don't think we got to the other 2 as well. I had to kind of put 2 classes together so that we are able to get through everything for the 34th. Okay, we are still, oh, actually, you know what? I think this is still considered, you know what? I'm not positive. I think it's activity 2, and we are in assignment 27. So this is about, both these assignments are relating to Farley Mowatt. Farley Mowatt was one of Canada's most well-known writers, whose work often draws attention to damage to nature by people and government policies regarding the treatment of endangered species of animals. One of Mr. Mowatt's novels is called Never Cry Wolf. So our very first assignment, number 27, is to do some research. You can use the internet at your learning center or books, whichever is going to work, to do a little research on him. You are to find information about where and when he was born, his interests, his career as a writer, including the names of at least some of his works. You have to list them all, there's a lot. His accomplishments and any recognition or awards he's received, and anything else that you think is important that you would like to include. Your response should be at least half a page handwritten in paragraph format. It is assumed that you will be writing a rough copy, which should then be revised and edited. However, it is necessary only to submit the final copy. That's probably mine. So there are a lot of skills to doing a research project. You have to know whether a website or a book is reliable, truthful, biased. You have to figure out how to prioritize what information is important, summarize large amounts of information into a shorter, more brief account, and rewrite information into your own words. I want to point out that it is not okay to just cut and paste whatever you find into a document and hand that in. It is usually very obvious when students do this, and I will return your assignment unmarked and ask that you rewrite it in your own words if you do this. All right. So when you are looking at a resource, you always want to try and decide, is this going to be helpful to me? And so here's kind of like a list of questions that you might want to think to yourself when you're trying to assess, is this helpful or is it not? So first of all, how relevant is it to my topic? So we're talking about Farley Mowatt, an article that was only dedicated to, say, just one of his books might not be that useful to us, might be too detailed, which brings us to how vague or how detailed is it? Something that's very short and very vague is often not going to be that helpful because there isn't much for you to summarize. It's already been summarized. On the other hand, if it's way too detailed, it can be so much information, it can be hard to decide what is important. So you want to try and find a happy medium for that when you're looking at articles. How many pages long is it? Again, a book that's an entire biography on Farley Mowatt is way too much for this. Same thing if you're looking at a 20-page article, it's too much. You want to find something that's much smaller, that maybe hits the highlights and gives you some information to get an idea, but not so much that you're overwhelmed. Which goes along with how much information we're looking for. We're only writing half a page, so we don't need an enormous amount. The next two items are kind of trickier. One is the information reliable or true? One way to look at this is, do other resources confirm or disagree with the information that's been provided? And then, is the person or the organization who wrote the article considered reliable, or are they considered biased? So let's say I turn on my computer and I go to try and look up Farley Mowatt. If I just write Farley Mowatt into the search engine, here's what comes up at the very top. I see a lot of photos and then a bunch of books, tiny little thing about this is not that useful, just not enough information. I'm going to have to scroll down the page and not just use the first things I see so that I don't just end up with images. Now, even when I go down a little bit, because Farley Mowatt was a novelist, what tends to come up initially is places to buy his books rather than articles about him. So that probably is not going to be as helpful. But once you go down a little bit, then you begin to get stuff from like the New York Times, the Canadian Encyclopedia. This first one says Farley Mowatt, author, dies at age 92. So that might be an obituary, which could be useful for his accomplishments. The Canadian Encyclopedia looks like they've got an article on him because it is specifically a Canadian-based encyclopedia. It might have more relevant information. It's probably reliable. It may be more in-depth, might be too in-depth. You'll have to kind of look at that and decide. Don't really look at the movies. Okay, it's not actually going to be helpful. Movies generally have so little relationship to the books that it's not usually that useful. Now, generally, one of the very first things that always comes up is Wikipedia. And I wanted to talk about Wikipedia. It can be a great place to start your research, but please do not make it your only internet resource. And this is for several reasons. First, Wikipedia has what's called an open editing function, which means that its information is not always 100% reliable, right? It can be edited by various different people. And if somebody changed things, sometimes because they think it's funny, sometimes because they're being malicious, if you aren't already pretty familiar with the subject, you're not really going to know. Two, if you are going on to college or university, they don't allow you to use Wikipedia as a source for those at that level. And I want you to develop the habit of avoiding it as a main resource so that you're not surprised when it happens the first time. Third, it's only one source. Because people have heard of it so much, though, I will find that people tend to over rely on it and don't look at the information critically. You want to use multiple sources to make sure that the work that you're doing includes multiple viewpoints and a wide array of information. The most useful thing about Wikipedia actually is at the bottom of their articles, they usually have a little spot that will say something like external links, or it will talk about like sources for their articles. And that usually has all sorts of links to different articles that they got their information from. And those can be a really useful treasure trove of resources to try and read. Okay. Because the internet is so huge, it can be really hard to sort out which resources are reliable and trustworthy and which ones are not. So I'm going to try and walk you through the process of deciding whether a resource is reliable. Sorry, Grammarly consistently wants to come up and overtake my computer here. Just kind of talking about the part about it being an open editing and not always being reliable. There's actually a really interesting Wikipedia article that talks about some of the controversies. Some of the things that have happened that have made it sort of less reliable is sometimes businesses have paid editors to whitewash information about their business. Politicians and their aides have deliberately altered information to remove negative information they didn't want out there. Sometimes there have been hoax articles created about completely non-existent people. Sometimes there have been deliberate smear attempts against certain people, including one article that called someone a terrorist and resulted in that person getting pulled over at customs because they were a possible terrorist. So that's kind of some of the issues that happen because multiple people are able to edit that. So it's not really considered 100% reliable. So how can you decide whether a resource is considered reliable? Well, there's a couple of places you can check. One possibility is to look at what is its reputation or its consideration for reliability from an outside source. And reliability in any kind of media source is based on a number of factors. First of all, the most important one is, do they deliberately print news that they know is false? If they do, then obviously, then they are unreliable, don't use them. The next one is a little trickier. Do they deliberately print news that they have not checked for truthfulness? This is the kind of thing where they'll say something like, so-and-so says blah, 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 but they don't bother to check it. All they're doing is reporting what someone said. When that happens, that is also a sign that they're unreliable because you don't know whether that information is true or not. Do they share the source of their information when it will not put the source at risk, right? Many newspaper reporters have very protective feeling towards their sources. And obviously, if someone's going to get hurt or fired or whatever, if they are found out, then they don't report that. But generally, when things are slightly less risky, reporters will say where they got their information from, okay? When they do that, there's a much greater chance that they are reliable. But you want to make sure that their source is reliable and trustworthy. So for example, if the president of the United States declares that the US is about to go to war to China, well, he's the leader of the country and therefore he knows he's part of the one that's declaring. If Joe Schmo, who just owns a business selling shoes, but has no links to the government, the army, or anything, and he announces that it's about to happen, it's not reliable. He's not a trusted source. You would not want to use that article or any information put out by that person. Okay. The other things to look at. Media that consistently reports false news is considered completely unreliable. It's kind of a spectrum, right? But media that consistently does not check their facts is also unreliable. They may be telling the truth, but you have no way of knowing because they don't particularly care about truthfulness. And like I said, media that won't share their sources are also considered unreliable because you don't necessarily, as an ordinary citizen, have a way of checking whether their sources are valid or reliable. Media sources that are trustworthy will not print fake news. They will check for truthfulness. They will report their sources when possible, and they will use reliable and valid sources for their information. Somebody who's, say, known to be unreliable has a history of telling lies, of creating hoaxes. No one who's responsible is going to use them as a resource, right? So, how does the average person know all this? Well, there actually are some organizations that monitor this type of thing and they publish their results. So, here is this is called the media bias chart. And if you look down the left side of the chart, you can see they've put a summary there of how reliable each resource is generally considered. At the top is items that are considered very high reliability, high levels of fact reporting, and original fact finding. In other words, they have had reporters go out and investigate and confirm that something is true. They haven't just relied on the fact that someone else has said so. They've checked it out themselves. In the middle area here are media that state a lot of opinions or analysis, which may or may not be questionable. At the very bottom down here are media where reports may be completely made up or completely fabricated. So when you're looking at this, how reliable is something like the National Enquirer considered? Well, you try and find it and then see where it's listed. So let's see, National Enquirer. Let me think. We've got New York Post, National Review. Oh, here we go, National Enquirer. Okay, so it's down in this section at the bottom. And over here it says it will contain misleading information, or it will contain inaccurate or fabricated, in other words, deliberately made up information. So that's not a good resource to use. What about the New York Post? Okay, so New York Post is kind of in the middle. So it has a lot of analysis, high variation in reliability. So sometimes it's reliable, sometimes it's not. Also has a lot of opinion. But then if you're looking for New York Times, let's see, where's New York Times? Sorry, it's okay, way up here. Now they're not called New York, right? So that can be tricky, but up here, New York Times generally does a lot of what's considered factual reporting. Not necessarily original fact, but definitely fact reporting. So they would be considered more reliable. The other thing you have here, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, is a lot of media sources will have a political bias, right? They may skew very left wing, or they may skew very right wing, or they may be kind of in the middle. This is sort of important to consider because certain kinds of issues may be viewed very differently by people on the left versus people on the right. I don't want to spend a lot of time going into that because I don't know if it's very relevant for what we're talking about today, but it is just something to be mindful of, especially if you're looking at something that is like a real political issue. Okay. So for information on historical figures such as Farley Mowatt, we may want to look specifically at sites that promote knowledge of Canadian history. And I can try adding that to my search terms to see if different items come up that are more relevant, more targeted. So here are some of the search terms I tried. Historical importance of Farley Mowatt, literary importance of Farley Mowatt, criticism of Farley Mowatt, influence of Farley Mowatt. And so some of the things that came up was there's a Canadian Encyclopedia article about him. There's a very interesting documentary about him. There's an interview in Maclean's about him. Maclean's is a very reliable news magazine for Canada. Then here's a really interesting critique about his reliability and truthfulness, a look at his writing style, and then a review of one of his controversial books. So those are some possible places to start. You do not have to use those. I'm just trying giving you sort of a few possible examples. So basically you're doing this research to be able to write a short biography or summary of Farley Mowatt's life and work. Biographies in general start with information regarding parents, place of birth, date of birth, siblings, and anything that is crucial about that time period, like the death of a parent or a move to another country. A longer biography might go into details about someone's childhood in school, A shorter biography doesn't necessarily need to, unless school and childhood was a major influence on their life and work. Generally, any major influences on their work are usually mentioned. That might include things like world events, such as wars or famines, mentors, friends, or enemies who helped or harmed them in their work, major social or political movements, such as women's rights, civil rights, the rise of communism, major life experiences, marriage, children, disease, sicknesses, financial disasters, successes, awards, important jobs. Generally, they try and put this in chronological order. Remember to look for controversies. That can often be a key thing to be aware of. So summarizing is another important research skill. It's connected to prioritizing. Summarizing is when you take a large quantity of information and you shorten it by giving an overview of the most important or the main ideas. How much we summarize or shorten depends on the amount of room we have to write or the size of our basket. All the food in the grocery store may be good, but we don't necessarily have room for it all in our basket. Since we're only writing about half a page, that's kind of a small basket. All the facts might be interesting, but they won't all fit. So how do we decide which information constitutes the main or the important ideas? By prioritizing. So prioritizing is when you kind of decide which facts are important. In this case, which facts are important to mention in a summary of their life. So while I gave you kind of a short list of possible areas to look at, you have to keep in mind that each person is different. So one person's place of birth may have had a profound effect on their life. So for example, a Jewish person born during the time period of the Nazis in Germany, that's going to have an enormous effect over their entire life. Whereas somebody who wasn't Jewish and was not born in Germany, but at the same time period, that may not be so important where they were born. Same goes for things like school, family, friends, children. The thing to look for is what was a huge priority, like what did they think was important, or what had a huge effect or influence on them. Did a crippling disease affect their outlook on life? Did an abusive father or extreme poverty? What affected them the most, either for good or for bad? So summarizing is definitely not easy. And here are some common summarizing mistakes. First of all, only using one article or one book as your source. Number two, writing down the first 10 to 15 important facts you read, and then just stopping without worrying about whether it reflects their whole life. Number three, copying sentences from an article word for word without putting it into your own words. Number four, being so vague and general that you don't learn anything important about the person, like your reader doesn't. Or number five, being so detailed that you include way too much information without attempting to determine what is really important. So I'm going to kind of walk you through what I mean. So I've used Wikipedia just because it kind of has a lot of stuff to kind of go through. I don't want you to, and this is kind of some of the reasons. It's way too detailed for one thing in this particular case. If I tried to read this article and summarize each sentence, I'm not really summarizing. Just putting each thing in my own, each sentence into my own words, it's going to be way too long, and it's actually harder to do, although I think it seems easier to people at first. So Lincoln was born into poverty in a log cabin in Kentucky and was raised in the frontier, primarily in Indiana. So I changed that into Abraham Lincoln was born poor in a cabin in Kentucky. He grew up on the Indiana frontier. He was self-educated and became a lawyer, Whig Party leader, Illinois state legislator, and U.S. representative from Illinois. He became a lawyer, a Whig Party leader, Illinois state legislator, and U.S. representative from Illinois. So what happens here is I don't really know how to summarize that. So I just kind of repeated it. So unintentionally, without intending to, I'm basically plagiarizing. So I'm using someone else's words and acting like they're my own. It also comes off really sort of wooden and stiff. I don't really know what all these things are or why they're important. So I'm just including them because someone else has written them. It's not really that good in terms of doing research. Here's an example of what I could do instead. Here, I'm reading the whole thing and I'm just making myself some quick notes. They aren't sentences, they're just a few brief ideas. We often call these jot notes. So what I've written is born in Kentucky, lived in Indiana, lawyer, party leader, state legislator, federal Illinois rep, 1949, restarted his law practice, 18, oh, sorry, that should be 1849, not 19, 1854, upset by the Kansas-Nebraska Act because the new territories were to use slaves. In 1860, he ran for president, which caused the southern states to succeed or try and break free. Now, looking this over, I would actually want a lot more information. This isn't enough for me to create a good paragraph, okay? So in that case, what I would probably do is start to look for another source and add some more information to my jot notes before I begin doing any kind of writing at all. So now here's a completely different article. This is from Britannica, which is a very famous encyclopedia site. They're a great site to look for information about. So here they talk completely different. By the way, there's a little bit of ... in the middle, and I took out some information because there was an insane amount of detail about his childhood that just was not important. So here we've got Abraham Lincoln, born February 12th, 1809, near Ogdenville, Kentucky, U.S., died April 15th, 1865, Washington, D.C., was the 16th president of the United States, who preserved the Union during the American Civil War and brought about the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. In December 1816, faced with a lawsuit challenging the title to his Kentucky farm, Thomas Lincoln, that was his father, I think, moved with his family to southwestern Indiana. There, as a squatter on public land, he hastily put up a half-faced camp, a crude structure of logs and bows, with one side open to the weather, in which the family took shelter behind a blazing fire. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's a little bit too detailed. I got to be honest. It does give me a lot more information on his early years, which gave me some context to understand him better. So now I go through, I add some more information on my jot notes to the beginning. I would probably look up something else to get some more information on the latter part of his life before I actually started to write, okay? So right now I'm just going to tackle his early years. Now, I'm not looking at the original article. I'm looking at my jot notes. And one reason for this is it's way easier for me to put things in my own words when I'm not looking exactly at someone else's sentence. It can be really hard to think of a sentence of your own when you're reading someone else's. It's kind of overwhelming, like looking at a light, that's all you can see. Also, because I've combined different sources, it becomes much harder to plagiarize accidentally. So now I end up with this paragraph instead. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809 in Kentucky. They moved to Indiana when he was very young and grew up so poor, they didn't even have a whole house, just a sort of half cabin at first. He helped to farm and clear the land they eventually built a proper cabin on. He didn't like growing up that poor, nor did he enjoy activities such as hunting and fishing that went with frontier life. His mom died in 1818 when he was only 9 years old, but his dad got remarried next year to a woman named Sarah. She had children of her own, 2 girls and 1 boy, and they all lived very well together. Abraham loved her very much. So now I've got a sentence or a paragraph that's completely mine. It's not going to look like anyone else's. And that is what I'm looking for with research, okay? When you're doing this, remember to write a good opening sentence. Even though we are writing a biographical sketch or paragraph, we still want to use good paragraph structure. It's really common for biographical writers to mention what the person they are writing about is famous for, even in the very first sentence, to help give the reader context that will help them understand all the detail that follows. So remember that our paragraph structure, opening sentence, a bunch of main details, and then a closing sentence that should echo the opening in some way. So here are some examples of a good opening sentence. Muhammad Ali, famous both for his boxing and his words of wisdom, was born in not boxes. Sorry, boxy. I don't know why it says that. Mother Teresa, known the world over for her charity work with the poor in India, was born to Marilyn Monroe, adored for her beauty, talent, and wit, was the child of. So I've immediately told you right away what are they famous for, so you know why you're reading. And now, a lot of people will know, but sometimes if it's somebody new to you, you won't know. The other thing is you want all your details, but then you want to make sure you've got a good closing sentence that summarizes your mini biography. You don't want to just stop writing like, oh, they died in 1860. Done. No. You want to tie up their writing with a great sentence that highlights their importance. You could use different phrases, things like, this person will always be remembered for. Although gone, their influence continues in. Their efforts in this field created. The work they started is continued by. They would be proud to be remembered as. You just kind of, again, tie up what was their big picture importance. Also, as you're writing, remember to use transition and introductory words and phrases to help create good flow and connections between your sentences. Sorry, I'm trying not to cough here. Taking a little sip of my drink so that I don't cough. My apologies. Okay. One thing to keep in mind as you're writing is to try and make sure your transitions from one sentence to the next sentence are very smooth for the reader. Because you're pulling from multiple sources and trying to stick to the facts, sometimes people forget that it's still important to use their creative writing skills to make things sound interesting. And transition phrases are one really important way to do that. They can help point out sequence, connections, cause, and effect. So here are some sequencing ones like after that time period, after that experience, following this disappointment, frustration led to, finally, at last, eventually, gradually, suddenly, motivation or cause and effect. Due to this situation, because of this occurrence, this resulted in, this event spurred him on to, this experience created a passion. His need of blah, 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 developed from this event. This development led him to exploring blah, 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 whatever it's going to be. Okay? Makes sense? Okay. When you're finished that, you're going to look at this. This is number 28, in the company of wolves. This part's worth 25 marks. So right in your unit, they've included a short excerpt from the novel by Farley Mowatt. Every now and again, I have students kind of panic and go, I don't have the book. No, you're not having to read the whole book. You're reading a tiny little bit of it, just a few pages. So I just want you to read those few pages that we've included right in your unit, and you're going to write a brief summary of his experience as he wrote about it, okay? Again, this is super short. You're just telling me 7 sentences. It should include the main idea and some supporting details. There are some keywords that might be difficult, and in your unit, they're provided at the end of the selection. I'm going to kind of talk about them right now. Okay, so it's just like a little tiny mini glossary. They have got the word preternaturally, so unusually, extraordinarily, self-engrossed, preoccupied, self-absorbed, captivated, vouchsafed, given to, or provided, inconspicuous, hidden, or camouflaged. Lupine means it's of or it's like wolves. Abutted is bordered or joined. Circumference, the distance around something, a boundary. Copious is plentiful or generous. Cognizance is awareness or familiarity. Transgressed is exceeded, violated, the idea of doing something kind of wrong, basically. Temerity is things like carelessness, recklessness. And then baleful is threatening or harmful. And we just kind of included this here because there's some words that are tricky, and it's just a nice, quick way to get those words across to you. So before you start to read, I want to point out, this is a really important article called Never Cry Wolf. Was it a work of fiction or nonfiction? It was originally published as nonfiction. In other words, that it was true, that it was scientific. One of the things that came out a while later was that it was really not 100% true. So this particular article is a review that looks at it from the point of view of a scientist, and he kind of examines how factual or truthful. I'm I'm including this because I felt a little uncomfortable having you read this part of the article thinking that it's 100% true when it's really not. It's a little bit controversial, and some parts are 100% true. Farley Mowatt himself is widely known to have said that he never let facts get in the way of a good story. He termed his style of writing subjective nonfiction, and he felt that he operated in a gray area. He was very comfortable operating in the gray area. He liked that. But the problem is that his books were portrayed as 100% true, and they were hugely influential at the time on public opinion, including changing like government policies for how they handled things, including like wolves. So when it came out that it was not 100% true, it was quite a controversial thing and caused a lot of anger and upset, which he kind of didn't care about, but it was upsetting. So I'm not going to read the whole excerpt, but this is just kind of the beginning of it. Quite by accident, I had pitched my tent within 10 yards of the major paths used by the wolves when they were coming to or coming from their hunting grounds to the westward. And only a few hours after I had taken up residence, one of the wolves came back from a trip and discovered me in my tent. He was at the end of a hard night's work and was clearly tired and anxious to go home to bed. He came over a small rise 50 yards from me with his head down, his eyes half closed, and a preoccupied air about him. Far from being the preternaturally alert and suspicious beast of fiction, this wolf was so self-engrossed that he came straight on to within 15 yards of me and might have gone right past the tent without seeing it at all, had I not banged my elbow against the tea kettle, making a resounding clank. The wolf's head came up and his eyes opened wide, but he did not stop or falter in his pace. One brief sidelong glance was all he vouchsafed to me as he continued on his way. It was true that I wanted to be inconspicuous, but I felt uncomfortable at being so totally ignored. Nevertheless, during the 2 weeks that followed, one or more wolves used the track past my tent almost every night, and never, except on one memorable occasion, did they evince the slightest interest in me. So you would want to finish reading that before you go on. Much like the biography paragraph, the summary paragraph is still going to follow our hamburger structure. It should have a main topic up top as the bun. The body sentences should be lots of good details that summarize what happens. And then the closing sentence should restate the topic or the main point of the summary paragraph. The assignment says, give me 7 sentences. And I wanted to point out the difference between 7 very short, simple sentences versus 7 very long, complex, or compound sentences. It makes a huge difference on how much information and how complex you are able to make your paragraph, okay? So here's kind of the simple basic sentence version. I did Lord of the Rings. Obviously, I didn't want to use this assignment because I don't want to do the work for you. Gandalf the wizard visits a hobbit called Bilbo. He wants him to come on an adventure with a group of dwarves. Bilbo turns him down. Gandalf tricks him into coming anyways. At first, Bilbo is scared and not very helpful. He starts to be helpful in unexpected ways and gains courage. The book ends in a war that the dwarves and their supporters win. So it's a summary. It's pretty basic, though. There's a lot you wouldn't understand if that was all you had understood or had read. Here is a slightly more complex paragraph. Gandalf the wizard visits a hobbit called Bilbo because he wants him to come on an adventure with a group of dwarves. Bilbo turns him down, but Gandalf tricks him into coming along anyways. At first, Bilbo is scared and not very helpful, and the others wonder why Gandalf wanted him to come. Bilbo stumbles upon a mysterious ring that bestows invisibility upon him and helps him astonish the dwarves with his new confidence and abilities. Bilbo uses the ring to help save the crew from giant spiders and to free them from the dungeons of the wood elves. They decide to send Bilbo ahead as a scout to the dragon under the mountain, and this leads to Bilbo taunting and teasing the dragon. The dragon becomes enraged and races off to destroy a nearby town, which leads the townfolk into an angry confrontation with the dwarves. Both the townsfolk and the dwarves are attacked by an army of evil creatures, but with the help of friends, they are able to win in this dramatic war. So all the part in black is actually 7 sentences, and then I added 1 extra sentence to kind of wind things. So I want to point out that you're not retelling, okay? When you retell, you stay faithful to the original story. It may only be a little bit shorter. It's like somebody making a movie from the book. It's kind of mostly the same, and you're generally trying to get every plot event into the retell. And it's usually judged by how similar or how close it is to the original story. But when you're summarizing, it's not going to cover every plot point. It's really only going to hit the most important points. It should be significantly shorter. It's like somebody trying to explain an entire book in 1 minute. And it's judged by how well it expresses the big ideas. Okay? It's a little bit different format. So I'm getting a little bit short on time. Ooh, I've got a little bit. If I were retelling Little Red Riding Hood, see how detailed this is. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Little Red Riding Hood who had a beautiful red cape she loved to wear. She became known as Little Red Riding Hood. Little girl. So fix that there. One day, she was walking through the woods to take food to her sick grandmother. She was carrying her basket full of goodies and singing to herself. Out of nowhere came a wolf. Where are you going? He asked her. I am on my way to Grandma's house, she replied. Then she went walking on her way. Well, quick as a flash, the wolf ran ahead to her grandma's house and swallowed up her granny in one big bite. So I could keep on going for quite a long time. A summary might be very different. One day, while a little girl went walking into the woods to bring food to her grandmother, she ran into a sneaky wolf. The wolf asked where she was going, and when she explained, he snuck off into the woods and got there before her. He ate up her grandmother and laid in wait for her. Fortunately, before he could harm her, a nearby forester rescued her by shooting the wolf. Finally, the forester was able to bring her safely back to her own house. So I haven't included any dialogue. I haven't included any details. It's just the big ideas. This is what you're aiming for, summarizing, okay? So when you're reading through it, how do you decide what's important, and how do you decide what do you prioritize? Different people may find different parts important. Some things to think about is, will the story still make sense if you leave this part out? For example, if I left out the part about the wolf running ahead to eat up grandma, it's not going to make sense if the wolf's in grandma's bed. But if I leave out the part about how she got her name, it doesn't really change my understanding of the story. Is it interesting, or is it vital to understand what's happening? So the part about Little Red singing might be interesting, but it's not crucial to understand the story, so I can leave it out of my summary. Things to think about when you're summarizing. If there is a lot of dialogue, you can often summarize it in a phrase or two. Here is a whole conversation between Bilbo talking back and forth to Gollum. I'm hoping that you've read the book. Sorry, this is one of those things where one bit has decided to be very strange for some reason. I'm not sure why. Hang on, I'm going to see if I can do something real. Let's see. No, didn't quite work. Okay. I can then change it into a much shorter version as Bilbo talks with Gollum and they get into a riddle match in which Gollum gets 3 tries to guess what is in Bilbo's pocket. This very long section got put into a much, much shorter section. I can do the same thing. Sometimes there's a lot of description describing a lot of little activities that I can put into one sentence. So like, John lined up at the starting line, he got into position, then the shot went off and he began running down the track. He was tired and beginning to fall behind, but he still came in second. Big picture, John ran a race and came in third, okay? Here, huge, long description of how something looks from East of Eden. I summarized it in kind of one sentence. In wet weather, the spring flowers in the valley were vibrant and colorful. Blue lupines, golden California poppies, yellow mustard, buttercups, and violets, as well as red and yellow groups of Indian paintbrush. Also, remember to include not just important events, but any important revelations or emotional changes. If they suddenly realize something or change their mind and it's important, make sure you get that across as well. So I'm kind of speeding up a little bit so I don't run out of room. Essentially, you want to convey all the most important information. You are only going to hand in a good copy, but it is assumed that you're going to spend some time revising and fine-tuning your first draft so it sounds a lot more smooth. So here's a choppy version or a rough draft. Jimmy returns to Green Star Lake after 18 months in juvenile detention. He is required to go back to school, which he hates. He is also required to stay away from drugs and alcohol. His old friends try to lure him back to that lifestyle. He gives in once, then realizes that this is a bad idea, and he refuses to go on the next drug run. It almost ends with his best friend dying while he tries to escape the cops. Later, this friend commits suicide, which sends Jimmy into depression. Jimmy slowly pulls his life together with the help of his friends and family. Now, here's a smoother version, and one thing that I want to point out is I tried to make sure to include those transition phrases that help you understand sequencing, cause and effect, and all those kinds of things. The book opens when Jimmy returns to Green Star Lake after 18 months in juvenile detention. However, he is still on probation, so he is required to go back to school, which he hates. As well, he is also required to stay away from drugs and alcohol. Initially, his old friends try to lure him back into the lifestyle of drinking and drugs. Jimmy gives in one time and spends a weekend partying, but comes to regret it. Despite his friends' pleading and mockery, he refuses to go on the next drug run. As his best friend races from the cops across the ice, as his friend races from the cops across the ice, his best friend almost dies when he falls through the ice with his skidoo. Jimmy risks death to pull him free from the ice and manages to save his life. Later, this friend commits suicide, which sends Jimmy into depression. By the end of the novel, Jimmy slowly pulls his life together with the help of his family and friends. So you want to take the time to transform your rough copy into a much better copy, okay? Okay, we are running short on time, so I'm not going to really go into the writing tips because I've kind of covered the main parts that I want you to look at, okay? So today is Thursday, and it is the last class before the holiday. We will not be back in school until January 6th, at which point we will start on assignment 29. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a good holiday.